Bonjour and hello, I'm James, and I'll be your host for this season of the Everyday Forum podcast, an original Stratfest at Home podcast showcasing a sampling of the thought-provoking discussions from the Stratford Festival's 2024 Meighen Forum. The Stratford Festival's Meighen Forum is a festival within the festival, designed to enhance and contextualize the performances in the main Stratford Festival season through compelling discussions, small-scale, exciting performances, and engaging multi-sensory events and workshops. Enjoy! Bonjour and good morning, everyone. My name is James Hyatt. I'm the Meighen Forum assistant. I'm very glad that you're all able to join us today for the Body Politic, a history of queer news in the gay and lesbian liberation era. At any event like this where we're examining history in Canada, it's necessary to address the historical and ongoing injustices faced by the Indigenous people of this land. In reflecting on the topic of queer history in particular, I'd like to start today by drawing our attention to the calls for justice put forward by the final report into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. These calls for justice are actions to be taken by all levels of government, by industry, and by individuals. The section on the calls for justice begins, quote, "As the evidence demonstrates, human rights and Indigenous rights abuses and violations committed and condoned by the Canadian state represent genocide against Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual people. It is all of our responsibility," that's the end of the quote, "it is all of our responsibility to end and redress this genocide, and I encourage you to familiarize yourself with the final report, but I'll highlight two of these calls for justice today." So the call for justice specifically to those of us working in the entertainment industry, which includes journalists, reporters, writers, and so on. Quote, "To take decolonizing approaches to their work and publications in order to educate all Canadians about Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people, including by ensuring authentic and appropriate representation of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people, inclusive of diverse Indigenous cultural backgrounds, in order to address negative and discriminatory stereotypes." End quote. The second call I'd like to read is for all Canadians. It calls us to decolonize by learning the true history of Canada and Indigenous history in our local area. Learn about and celebrate Indigenous people's history, cultures, pride, and diversity, acknowledging the land you live on and its importance to local Indigenous communities both historically and today. End quote. So in that spirit, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we're gathered on today, I'd like to acknowledge the land, and I'd like to acknowledge that the land is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas and other Anishinaabe nations, as well as the nations of the Neutral Confederacy, often referred to as the Attawandarong. This territory is still the home to many Indigenous people, and it is up to all of us that live and work and care for this land to care for it and care for its history if we want to keep enjoying it for generations to come. All right, immediately to my right, this is Nicholas Hrynyk. He is an assistant teaching professor of history at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, British Columbia. His research has explored images and understandings of gay male masculinity in the body politic during the gay liberationist years of the 70s and 80s. Currently, Nick is focused on the here and now, asking how historical understandings of gender and sexuality have shaped queer people's anticipation of, or apprehensions around, social, sexual, and physical violence. His work has appeared in the Journal of Canadian Studies, Disability Studies Quarterly, Canadian Journal of Anesthesia, and is forthcoming in Monumental Memories, a critical reading of memorials, monuments, and statues in Canada's capital region from McGill Queen's University Press. Nick. In the middle of our trio here is Tim McCaskell. Tim is a writer, activist, and educator. He was part of the Body Politic, Canada's first national magazine for lesbian and gay liberation, and chair of the Public Action Committee of the Right to Privacy Committee, which fought back against police raids on Toronto gay baths in 1981. In 1987, he was a founding member of AIDS Action Now, which over the next decade won access to experimental treatments, ethical clinical trials, and funding for medications. He's the author of Race to Equity, Disrupting Educational Inequality, A History of the Struggle for Equity in Toronto Public Schools, and Queer Progress from Homophobia to Homo-Nationalism, A History of Queer Activism in Toronto. Welcome, Tim. And last but not least, our moderator for today is Raegan Mary Swanson. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Dundee, Scotland, focusing on the role of community archives in Nunavik, Quebec. She worked as an archivist at Library and Archives Canada, as a digital archivist for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and as archivist and senior archivist at Anishchokamuk Cree Cultural Institute. She was the archival advisor for the Council of Archives New Brunswick, before becoming the executive director of the ArQuives with a Q. I never know how to communicate that. ArQuives with a Q. Canada's LGBTQ2+ archives in 2016. She was a member of the Steering Committee on Canada's Archives Task Force to respond to the Calls to Action report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and co-chair of the Association of Canadian Archivists Indigenous Matters Working Group. Welcome, Raegan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome today. Good morning to you all, and thank you for joining us. We are going to be talking a lot about the body politic today, and we look forward to your questions. We'll be getting those in just under an hour, so please don't be hesitant around those. We would love to hear what questions you have. We're going to be starting a little bit by giving everybody a chance to kind of understand where we're coming from when we're talking about the body politic. And then we're going to dive into the history of the early years by interrogating Tim a little bit. The body politic, of course, is such an influential publication, and we're lucky at the archives, again with a Q, to hold the business and institutional records of the body politic. So when I'm talking today, I'm coming at it from the point of view of an archivist, someone who was involved in the arrangement and description and making the records accessible to researchers now, people like Nick who come in and spend hours and hours and hours reading through correspondence and memos and things like that. Okay, we already know that Tim was involved, but how about you start and give a little rundown of how you became involved with the body politic, perhaps? And then we'll jump over to Nick before you kind of go a little bit more in depth.
Okay. So where does one start that story? I followed a young man who I was madly in love with, who was straight, before I was out, to South America in 1972, and it was all trauma drama stuff, right? And came back to Canada in 74 thinking, I've got to come out or jump off a bridge, right? And these are kind of the options, because this kind of life was not particularly satisfying. I spent a year teaching in Colombia and a year hitchhiking around South America. So when I came back, I started this process of coming out in the city that I hadn't lived in for 2 years. I didn't grow up in Toronto. I grew up in Beaverton, Ontario, which is a tiny little village north of Toronto. And at any rate, Beaverton was a dry town, so I didn't have a lot of experience with bars, and so going to a gay bar seemed pretty scary, and going to a bath, I didn't even know what those were. And so I realized that there was this gay paper in Toronto called The Body Politic, so I started buying it on the sly, very much on the sly, like buying a whole bunch of magazines like Popular Mechanics and Sports Illustrated and and The Body Politic. And then taking this paper, and it sounds funny now, but it's really kind of strange thinking back, taking it to the center of Riverdale Park, which is a big park downtown Toronto, with a track in the middle and no trees in it at that time. So if you were in the middle of it, you could see anybody coming within a quarter of a mile, literally, right? And that's where I would read my body politic, in the middle of that. And if anybody got too close, I could hide it, right? Reading that paper, it was all very strange, a new vocabulary, but I came across an article about what was happening in Pinochet's Chile to gay people. Now, I'd been in Chile shortly after the coup, and had been in South America for that time, and was aware of the kind of devastation that had caused. When I came back to Canada, it was as if, this is another kind of thing in some banana republic someplace, even though Chile does not grow bananas, right? And all of a sudden this gay paper was interested in this and making sense of it and saying, this is affecting gay people. And suddenly I found myself in an environment of the early sexual liberation movement or gay liberation movement that had connections with national liberation and other kinds of struggles that were taking place in different parts of the world. And so I thought, maybe this is the kind of place maybe this is my entry point. And so I ended up sort of going into the body politic and saying, I think I'm asexual, can I volunteer? And within about 6 months, I was no longer bisexual. Not to say that there aren't real bisexuals, but I was not one, and was a member of the Body Politic collective. So that was my entry into the organization.
Thank you. Nick, different experience coming in as historian to look at the archives and the Body Politic, but what about you?
Yeah. So how I came into the Body Politic itself was very much a direct relationship to my PhD. So one of the questions that has always been on my mind when I was, particularly in my master's, finishing that up, going into my doctorate, was thinking about, there's a certain image or aesthetic of gay men that we often see correlated with pride. It's white, it's muscular, it's young. There's a certain look. And I wondered, how did this get entangled with this idea of liberation? Like that is what pride looks like, right? As problematic and whitewashed as it is. And so I started exploring images from the 70s, largely because of the sort of post-Stonewall kickoff of gay liberation. I mean, you had homophile movements and whatnot, but really looking at the 70s and 80s. And I noticed that this was happening in a number of periodicals, a number of activist publications. But what I loved about the Body Politic was that not only was it one of the largest and it had the most meat to sink my teeth into, because like these issues, whether they were published monthly or bi-monthly, were like 40, sometimes 50 pages long, these copies. So there was a lot of commentary, but they were also very self-reflective on certain things. And they were critical of things like racial preferences and critical of like what they were seeing in terms of pornography or the type of content that was being perpetuated in the community. And so I really loved that type of criticism that was happening in the then and now, or, at that time. So I kind of ran with it. And then, so what started as looking at just issues, and then you have to go and trudge out the boxes. And there were a lot of boxes of memos and briefing notes. And a lot of it was great. And it was just sort of like, had a meeting. We did this. We discussed this. And it was like, okay, there's not a lot there. But you weirdly start to get to really know people. And it almost felt like I knew Tim or Gerald Hannon, the late Gerald Hannon, or Ed Jackson, or Ken Popert, and through their writing. And so then I would meet these people in real life and I'm like, I feel like I know you already because of everything you wrote, because I know when you wrote it. And sometimes talking to Gerald, he's like, did I write it then? Was it that year? I'm like, oh yes, it was that year. And so it was really a privilege to then not only read the Body Politic, but then have the opportunity to interview some of the former collective members about their time on the Body Politic and what brought them in and what their relationships and thoughts were around gender, sexuality, the aesthetics of gender that were being produced at this time, and how that sort of influence of the social and cultural of the queer community informed the political dimensions, right? And how that sort of reverberated with one another. Because it was 2016, I remember reading in Toronto Life, or it was maybe, I think it was Toronto Life or something. A journalist by the name of Brian Fleming wrote this article. I think there was a little satire to it called All About That Pride Body. And it talked about these men that were dieting before Pride, 2 months, 3 months before Pride, going to Tom Ford and getting flip-flops for the Cabana party. And I was like, okay, this is very, a little too on the nose. But there was a certain aesthetic that was like, you have to look this way to be proud. And I was like, ooh, that's very problematic, but we're still wrestling with these ideas, right? And to correlate it with pride, which is also has traditionally been a very deeply political movement, is then, it adds another dimension to it, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, the very first Body Politic came out in November 1st, 1971. On the cover was the We Demand protest, which happened in Ottawa in August of that year. There was many, many issues of the Body Politic that would follow, covering a variety of topics, and to varying degrees of acclaim or what would I call disclaim? I was going to go with police raids, but I was wondering if either of you had a favorite piece of writing other that you wrote yourself or that someone you rewrote. I know that some articles are very well known, but like there's a lot of writing that wasn't necessarily just political. There was writing that talked about the arts. There was writing that talked, it was a place to discuss community. So wondering if either one of you wanted to start off with your favorite article or a reoccurring article in some cases, maybe.
So I could be sycophantic here and say Tim McCaskell's writing on desire and racial preferences. It was a fantastic piece. But there was a piece written by Gerald Hannon on disability, and that really touched me. Because when I was reading it, it was, I believe, 1981, because it was just following the UN's International Year of the Disabled. And Gerald Hannon was writing about how, in many ways, the queer communities created a second metaphorical closet where they've shoved everybody who is old and disabled. And I thought that was just such a fantastic piece because he gave voice to Scott MacArthur and Richard, whose last name was withheld, both people with disabilities, one who had cerebral palsy. And when in his interviews, he gave them a voice. And I thought that was really important, a platform to talk about their experiences, about trying to navigate the queer community, particularly gay bars, as people with disabilities. And not just the physical barriers they would come across. And even Hannon said, count the stairs the next time you go to the gay bar and find out how inaccessible a lot of these spaces are, but also the social barriers about being laughed out of a bar because you're in a wheelchair or being told, why are you here? So these spaces that were not necessarily conducive or welcoming to all. So that really touched me to my core because I thought it just showed how thoughtful and how deeply empathetic the collective was to, not just hearing a very particular voice, right? White gay men calling the shots, so to speak, that it was a space for a lot of people to be a part of a community that they might not have otherwise see themselves a part of.
Have you thought of one, Tim?
I've thought of one actually, and along the same lines that Nick was talking. It was an article by Jim Bartley, the only article in its 15-year history around what today we call transgender people that really appeared in the paper. In those days it was transsexual, and traditionally there had been a pretty wide gap between the gay liberation movement and trans people. At the beginning, I think we were all sort of part of the same primeval muck of those people over there, right? But then when gay liberation happened, it really began to split. And influenced by certain sectors of the feminist movement, this notion that trans people were simply people who couldn't deal with their homosexuality and therefore wanted to become normative by becoming a part of the appropriate gender for their desires. I mean, that was kind of the dominant ideology. And so you didn't see anything about trans people in the paper until Jim wrote this article. And I talked to him when I was doing the research for Queer Progress and said, what did you go into this article expecting to write? And he said, well, I thought I was going to write that same kind of thing. These were poor people struggling with their homosexuality that they couldn't really cope. But when I talked to them, I began to see there was a real resonance between the kind of coming to terms with who they felt they were that gay people went through in terms of coming out. And so that was a kind of a breakthrough article. That was a kind of a watershed. But like everything else in history, it's kind of contradictory, because it was a watershed article in terms of beginning to recognize similarities between trans people and LGB people, right? But it also reflected a shift away from feminism as it was organized at the time in the paper. So that, that article probably wouldn't have been published 5 years before, because he wouldn't have wanted to upset people who we felt were our allies in the feminist movement who might have disagreed with it, right? And so it's odd how that kind of pivotal transitional movement has two different kinds of valences depending on the kinds of alliances and understandings people have of what this movement was all about. And it was kind of buried in there, but I think it was an enormously important article in terms of what happened subsequently.
There's quite a few people that we've referenced already. Most of them are men and most of them are white. And that is really a reflection of who was involved at the Body Politic. Tim, can you speak to that at all?
Yeah. First, there was only on the collective one person of color during the entire 15 years, Lloyd Wong, and he was not on for very, very long. It was a largely quite collective and a largely male collective. Chris Burchill was there from the very beginning, and Gillian Rogerson, and I'm blanking on a bunch of names you could probably produce. But yes, a small minority of women. Now, part of that had to do with the demography of Toronto in the 70s. Like, you looked at the racial composition of Toronto in 1970 was 95% white, right? Canada had 100 years of explicitly racist immigration policy, and that affects who's living here, right? So when that movement started, it was basically a bunch of younger white men, most of us from working class or lower middle class backgrounds, who were experiencing a kind of upward mobility because of the expansion of post-secondary education in the country in that Keynesian moment, right, when everybody was going to go to university for the first time, and for the first time you could get there for free, basically, right? I think I had a student loan of $200 my first year, right? I mean, that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. And so there were all of these kind of well-educated young men who were inspired by national liberation, black liberation, women's liberation, all of these kinds of things. And it was like, we were this gay liberation movement. Coming out became this litmus test for how liberated you were. And if you didn't come out, then somehow you were letting down the team. And that whole approach, I don't think, recognized that there were really different levels of risk in coming out for different people, depending on their social location. So, as a young white gay man in the 70s, if I got fired from my job, I could get another one, right? But that was not the case for, people of color who were at that point mostly relatively new immigrants, because immigration laws had just changed, or women who were in the labor force and who earned 60% of what men earned, right? So the kind of the things that were shaping who we were these broader social pieces of social organization. So I guess where the Body Politic began to fail was when it did not manage to change with the demographic change over the years, right? And its politics did not understand the political implications of that demographic change and what that meant in terms of whether people could come out or not, or even their notion of sexual identity, right? All of that kind of stuff, it was kind of an era. And so that last half decade from, say, 1980 on, there were increasing conflicts around questions of race and gender and those kinds of issues within the collective as people began to struggle with these new issues, because the demographics of the collective meant that we didn't have personal experience in the way that we'd had the personal experience of what it meant to be gay in the 70s. So once again, it's a complicated thing. Political failings, political successes, debates, arguments, and a real changing world that this group of people was attempting to accommodate itself to.
Nick, when you were looking at the body politic, how did you see power and privilege and those dynamics in terms of what you were seeing in the writing and the people that were not just authors, but maybe the people that were being highlighted?
Yeah, I mean, I could echo much of what Tim has said, but early on you can see that there is a predominantly white male structure to the body politic. That's not to say, though, that women weren't writing in. I mean, you had people writing and contributing, like Jane Rule. But you also had Chris Birchall on the editorial collective. So you had those. And even in the memos, you would see Chris pushing back on things to be like, no, we need to include this kind of content, stuff that, at one point I remember she wrote, why are there so many penises here? Like, why are there so many penises here? I'm like, yeah, it sounds like Chris. So going through it, but there were a lot of contributors from people who were from racialized backgrounds or describing perhaps their experiences as newcomers. One of the big tensions, to build off Tim's point, though, was that for a lot of people discovering their sexuality or coming to terms with their sexuality from racialized backgrounds, right, people of color, they would often reside within their quote unquote like ethnic neighborhoods. It'd be in like Chinatown or in Little Tokyo or in an area with more of a Caribbean diaspora, and they would then go to the village on the weekends, right? They would participate in village life on the weekends, and that was their connection to that culture. Whereas the village in itself was built up largely around those white middle class sort of boundaries or those kind of connections. And so the village in of itself, which the body politic often thrived within, reflected those types of racial nuances, right? And that type of inability for some folks to necessarily leave their sort of ethnic neighborhoods and stuff because they were, staying with family, of course, or something, right? And they were young. And so, but you do see that change in the 80s. You do see, I wouldn't always say there was always political failings. I think AIDS changed a lot of that conversation. 1981 comes around, there starts to be, and of course there's always concern. There's sort of speculation, this is a right-wing hoax. Who's the New York Times to reporting this sort of fabricated fake news, right? Fake news of the 1980s. By 82, I remember when I was interviewing Ken Popert, he's like, nope, something's going on. That's when I knew like something was happening. It was Gerald Hannon, I want to actually say, that went to New York City. And yes, thank you, Michael Lynch, yes. Michael Lynch went to New York City and he was like, by 82, and he said, something's going on. Nope, something is not right here. And so that changed a lot of the conversation. And speaking to some people who were around then, people of color, they also felt that, just even AIDS activism didn't always reflect their experiences as people of color, right? Particularly for Black Americans and Black Canadians. So I think that was also a point of consternation. But I can speak, there's so many, points about that multi-layered discrepancy of where the sort of miscommunications. And there was also a lot of disagreements within feminism, and that would played out on the papers. Like Andrea Dworkin's writing in very anti-pornography. But then you had some that were like, no, pornography is a way of sexually liberating women. So you have like the porn wars, as they call them, right? Or the feminist sex wars. And that was actually playing out in the body politic as well, which was so shocking for me because I just wasn't expecting those types of discussions to be happening in a gay and lesbian newspaper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've talked about race, we've talked about gender, sexuality. One thing that we talked about last year for folks that were here for last year's event was also the economic realities of the community and how they were coming in. We talked a little bit about, Chris's writing. Last year we talked about Chris Burchell's writing that, is super left, Marxist in nature, and how that influenced the paper, especially in some of the writing as well. So, Nick, this time, do you want to start and maybe say, how did you see that the economics of power, privilege, like we're still talking power and privilege here, but the economics and the impact of the left, we would say the left writing that was playing out through this, the liberation side, if you will.
Absolutely. Well, the Body Politic, by and large, and I don't like to paint with too broad a strokes, but they were by and large very left-leaning in terms of that sort of Marxism, that sort of socialist ideology. I would see that, of course, you'd see Ed Jackson writing things that were fairly Marxist in tone about economic disenfranchisement, right? There were a lot of concerns about the fact that if you're gay and you get fired from your job, and Tim said, yeah, you can get another job, but you also had no recourse. You had no protections. You could be evicted for being gay, and there was no recourse. You did not have protections until they were enshrined in the 80s. And so for the 70s, and especially those early years of the paper, it was all about disrupting this neoliberal economic system that contributed to the disenfranchisement of marginalized groups, most notably gay men and lesbians. And that's also partly, as Catherine Nash has argued, why the village formed in some respects. It was about living, dying, breathing in the village, supporting your own, building that sort of collective security because of those types of economic forces working against you in the broader Canadian society. So the Body Politic wanted to address those. And so it had a lot of Marxist leanings. What I think was interesting, and you do see beginning tensions, is as there is growing upward mobility for a lot of white cis gay men, you begin to see sort of the rise of the pink dollar, and that would push against it lightly. But by and large, the collective was quite left-leaning. And you also see that, though, intersect with the sexual liberationist ethos of the Body Politic, where all sexuality is good sexuality for the most part. And so that Marxist is who's the state to tell us who to love, was very much in the same line of thought of who's the state to kind of economically oppress us or control the means or levers of wealth. So there was this sort of intersection of the two.
Yeah. And Tim, how did you see that play out towards the end of the Body Politic when you have less people power and, the economics of running a newspaper in the 1980s was already starting to be something that was hard. Well, it was always hard, but hard in a different way.
Yeah, it was Ken Popert that pointed this out when I was doing my research. He said that the material basis of the Body Politic was volunteers. There was the collective. There was 10 of us or so, most times, it fluctuated a little bit, who were originally the people who did just about everything. But as time went on and the paper got bigger, we became more like an editorial board that set general policy and general direction and which articles and did the editing and that kind of stuff. And then there were these concentric circles of volunteers who did things like deal with the classified ads, deal with the distribution of the paper, run things back and forth from one place to another, because this was before you could press a button and your thing would be from one side of the country to the other, right? All of that volunteer labor had to do, I think, in the 70s and even the very early 80s with a kind of a Keynesian system, which is, I look at this crowd here, most of us grew up in, which meant that if you lost your job, would be able to get unemployment insurance. That's what they called it, unemployment insurance in those days. If you wanted to go to university, it wasn't hard to get the money to do that. If you had the marks, you could get a loan or you could get something like that. You didn't worry about growing old because there was old age pensions, and those were pretty good. And things got really bad, you might have to go on welfare, but you could do that. But by the neoliberal period, beginning, say, roughly 1980, and the austerity, waves of austerity, and all of those kinds of programs that had supported us disappearing, it meant that people didn't have volunteer time left on their schedules. You had to work 2 jobs, right, to pay for an apartment in Toronto, rather than being able to work 1 job and having some free time. You had to worry more about your trajectory, where you're going to have a job good enough that was going to give you a pension or that kind of thing. You had to worry about if you had a family, like how were you going to support a family if you were kind of a dyke with a bunch of kids, that kind of thing. So all of these issues became, I think, more and more shaping of people's lives. And so I'm just a very specific example. In the early days, we had 2 employees, one of whom was on staff, who we paid, and the other who was on unemployment insurance. And they would cycle, right? So you'd work for as long as staff was to be eligible for a year on UIC, and then we would give that person a layoff, hire the other person, and that person would work for us, but getting the money from UIC. And so, I mean, this was something that's no longer possible, right? So it was a subsidy, right? A subsidy coming from the government that allowed this small paper to work. When neoliberalism really took hold, those kinds of economics are no longer possible. People don't have the time to do that kind of volunteer stuff. And so what you saw was we had to begin to get more and more full-time staff, and that meant that we had to pay people, and that meant that we had to sell more papers, and that meant we had to become more popular, and all sorts of things flowed from that. And at the end, the staff were overworked and underpaid, and the paper wasn't being able to maintain itself anymore financially, and the whole thing began to become like a very shaky house of cards until it finally kind of collapsed in 1986, 87, in the winter of 86 and 87. So I think the economics of running small community papers was very different in the Keynesian era from the neoliberal era. I don't think people sometimes appreciate this. We are like all the proverbial frogs in the slowly heating bodies of water that don't realize that we're being boiled alive until it's suddenly too late to jump out, right? And we are now all being boiled alive, as you can see, right?
So now the Body Politic is one of the archive's most popular collections in terms of people coming in and looking at the papers. So I would say that we received the Body Politic, so the archives, for those that weren't here last year, where I talked at length about it, is an organization that's been around for 51 years and really grew out of the Body Politics paper because there was nowhere safe for the material that was being sent to the Body Politic to be deposited. There was nowhere that it would be safe and nowhere that, community would be able to access it. So I think there's a lot of important community organizing and groups that came out of the Body Politic as well. The archives, of course, is close to my heart, not only because they employ me, but also because as an archivist, as a historian, going through the papers really brings a sense of community. It's really a chance to see that there is a history there, that you're not alone. You can feel the community, different groups that existed. What type of communities do you think were able to, I know that the paper was circulated nationally, but also internationally. What communities do you think had opportunities because of the Body Politic existing, or that were influenced by the Body Politic to kind of grow out of it? Anything come to mind other than the archives? Is direct.
Other than the archive, after 77, my focus was doing the international news. So once a month, I would have to read all the lesbian and gay newspapers from everywhere in the world and do kind of summaries of what was going on in different parts of the world. And that isn't as enormous a task as it might seem now, because there weren't that many, right? It was a stack of papers about this high that had to be read. Most of them in English, some in French. I had to have someone do the German translations for me. Spanish I could handle. So I think the availability of that kind of material in the paper helped inspire groups, people from those kinds of backgrounds who had come to Toronto, to be in connection with what was going on in their countries that they had left, but also to recognize the importance of maybe organizing around issues that were of importance to them, but always went unnoticed or undernoticed in a broader Canadian context. So I wouldn't want to say the Body Politic inspired such groups as Exami, for example, or Gay Asians, but thinking about Gay Asians Toronto, and Richard and I went down to the March on Washington with another friend, Tony Souza, in 1979. And there was a Third World Lesbian and Gay Conference corresponding with the March on Washington. And so Richard and Tony were suddenly sucked into this kind of stuff. And when they came back, they organized Gay Asians Toronto, which was the first kind of racially specific gay organization in the city. And so, that trip happened because I was going down to write articles about the March on Washington. And so, in fact, the Body Politic there facilitated in a kind of a roundabout way the production of a new organization in the city. And so the fact that there was this kind of community hub that involved a lot of people, I think indirectly, even though not directly in the same way as the archives, did mean that the potential for organizing in all sorts of other cross-intersectional communities was recognized and then took off in Toronto in a way that perhaps didn't take off in other parts of the country.
Yeah, and I'll note that the exchange program that existed between the Body Politic going out to other countries and those countries sending their newsletters back to Toronto actually has resulted in the archives collection becoming the largest LGBT periodical collection in the world. And those countries now come to Canada to have access to that material because it no longer exists in many countries. So we've had people from Brazil and Spain and I think want to say Venezuela.
Colombia. I can tell you that story that somebody sent me a audio tape of a conference that had taken place in Amsterdam, a gay history conference, about something else that, because I was following somebody else. Anyway, one of the people who was on this panel was a young Colombian researcher who was talking about his attempt to chronicle the development of Ventana Gay, which was a magazine that came out of Bogota from the late 70s into the early 80s. And he was saying, but there's so few copies left in Colombia. I don't have I don't have the whole bunch of them by any means. He had scattered ones. And I thought, because I had a exchange subscription with Ventana Gay. So I phoned the archives up and said, I think it was probably you that I spoke to, and said, are the Ventana Gay things still there? And they said, oh yeah, we got those all digitized, right? So then I contacted this guy at the University of Utrecht, I think it was, in the Netherlands, and said, here's the whole series of Ventana Gay from the beginning to the end, right? They're in the archives here in Toronto, and he was completely blown away because, who would ever look for Colombian newspapers in Toronto, right? Unless you knew about those kinds of connections. So, that was an example that really hit home for me in terms of the importance of the kinds of collections that the archives have, especially from parts of the world that went through periods of repression or the movement was wiped out during the AIDS crisis or whatever, that lost that history in a way that we've managed to maintain here in the archives in Canada.
Yeah. It's very interesting to see folks coming in and doing that research, and not everything is, obviously not everything is connected to the body politic. We have many collections, but there's connections to the body politic in a lot of the collections that we don't necessarily always think of. When you're doing research, Nick, at archival institutions, that sense of finding things that you didn't expect. When you're doing your research, what was the thing that you found in those collections that you weren't expecting but had an impact on your research?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's often through the help of archivists who are like, hey, by the way, I thought you'd also be interested in this file and this file. And you're like, oh. And you come across some things that you find really interesting. But one of the things I really always thought was interesting with relationship to the body politic, one is that also that, we're talking about communities and whatnot, and the groups who were impacted was also just the readers themselves, and reading those letters back to the body politic of people writing from New Hampshire or writing from Italy. And they're like, I want more content on this. It's like, oh, okay, they'll get right on it. And it was interesting to see that individuals were affected by the body politic. But going back to the archives and you're doing this kind of work, and it's a little bit of a saddening kind of connection, is the relationship the body politic had with entrapment and finding files on entrapment, because the body politic is facilitating the queer community to link up. I mean, they had maps. John Seitz published a map in one of the early issues of the Body Politic saying, here are all the washrooms, here are all the parks, here are that. And guess who's also reading the Body Politic? The police. And so they're like, oh, great. And there's evidence and there's archival stuff showing that the police actually cut out glory holes in the washrooms to facilitate gay male sex in order to then entrap them. Or they would stand in plain clothes at a urinal and give the 1-2. They would cruise a bit. And then as soon as perhaps the what was a look turned into a slight action, the clothed officer would follow behind and arrest him for gross indecency, right? So there's evidence of that in the archives, and seeing those connections, and then seeing them these police reports, and then seeing them reported on in the next issue in the Body Politic. So you see that relationship with case file, and then the news report that would come out the month later, or the equally saddening, the 14 or so murders that would take place in Toronto in the 80s, roughly over a stretch at late 70s, and I think it went even into the 80s. But there was Harold Walkley, I believe, wrote about it, and it was interesting because you would read these reports, like the coroner's reports, or I would find reports from police, these files, and then you'd also see how the Body Politic was reporting on them, right? And what some of the rationale from even some in the community about why these murders were happening. And so it was really interesting to see how files that I would never otherwise look at would be connected to the Body Politic. But I can't take credit for that as much, because usually it was somebody being like, hey, here you go. Here are the supplementary files. So thank you for that.
Yeah, maybe the most famous example was the Don Franco case, where Don Franco was arrested in a small bath raid that took place in the barracks in '79 before the major ones. Anyway, he, unlike most of the people, actually went and complained about this. The police found out that he was a teacher. Then they phoned up the Board of Education he was working for and said, do you know that your teacher was caught in a gay bath doing unspeakable acts, right? And he complained about that because it's completely illegal for the cops to do that. And so the cops tracked down a classified ad he had in the paper where he would invite people to come over to his place. He had a kind of a dungeon and stuff. He was into kind of SM things. And they sent somebody over and explored the dungeon with him. And then the other cops arrived, and he was arrested for keeping a common body house in his own house, right? That became kind of a major case where we facilitated that attack on on Don, right? And he finally beat that case, but that was a long and very difficult struggle that the right to privacy had to take over.
And one other thing that I thought the Body Politic going back, and actually I reread this because I've read them, I wrote the dissertation, then I reread it, wrote the book, and now I'm even going back sometimes being, oh, I should have included this or this and that. But recently there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years about the LGBT purge in the government, right? And this was sort of at the forefront of news, and there was even a monument now being built in Ottawa. And Michelle Douglas is sort of head of that. But the Body Politic was actually reporting on this well before people were even, this was making headlines. And there was a young man who was a part of the Canadian military, and he was arrested outside of a gay bar in Halifax. And he was caught leaving one, and he was immediately discharged. And the Body Politic reported on it, and they even showed photos and whatnot. And so it's interesting to see, I was like, how did this not make news? It didn't, even in certain queer circles. And then it would be 2 more decades or so. And then, Michelle Douglas takes her case to court and basically finally ends that unofficial policy of preventing homosexuals in the government from, acquiring clearance, secret level, security, or even just being promoted, right? If they weren't subject to interrogations or being demoted or altogether just kicked out of the government, right? Or the military.
Yeah, there's a lot of, there's actually right to information requests that you can find in the Body Politic when they were doing their reporting on that went to, at the time, the National Archives, which is now Library and Archives Canada. And, they would come back and say, oh, no, there's nothing. And of course, now we know that they were actually withholding information from the public and also from different levels of government as well. So, the reporting that was being done at the Body Politic, in many cases, kind of set the stage for future reporting that would happen and would take place later on. Yeah. But let's talk about classified ads because you brought them up before. So we were Tim was talking about when we were preparing for this, trying to explain classified ads to younger generations. Now, I, as someone who does tours for, grade 7 to 12, I've had to explain what matchbooks were. So there's a certain level of, the younger generations might not understand about how communication between community members actually was happening. But classified ads have played a very large impact in the Body Politic, for better and for worse. But, the classified ads were an important part of the newspaper, an important part for community members to be able to put themselves out there.
I mean, my story about classified ads, I do these dinosaur talks, right, about prehistoric times. And there was a group in Toronto called Totally Outright, which is kind of young gay men mostly, gay and trans men who... It's done under the auspices of AIDS education, but it's much, much broader. Anyway, so we had a whole stack of old Body Politics that we passed around as I would do my talk. And then in the break, the young men would be reading, looking through these things. And I'd finished the talk, and I saw this young man at the back who was deeply, just completely engrossed in something in the paper. And I thought, what article from 30 years ago is catching his attention? So I walk over, and just as I got to him, he turns to the fellow beside him and he said, "Look at this. It's like Grindr, put on paper." And it was the classified ads. He'd never seen such a thing before, right? They wear away of people doing what people do today on Grindr, but it would take... So he said, well, how would this work? I said, well, you'd write in your letter to say what you wanted in your classified ads and pay the $2 or something, and then it would be published in the next issue of the paper, and then people would write in, and you'd have a box, and then you could either come in if you were in Toronto and get the letters that were in your box, or we would mail them out. And he said, that would take months. I said, yes, it would take months, right? That's the way it worked in those days, right? He was completely astounded. And so, yes, the classified ads, for better or for worse, the classified ads which got us into trouble over racism as well. Because what people say they want can be said in very unpleasant ways sometimes. And the Body Politic had a policy of not allowing anybody to say what they didn't like. So you couldn't say like no femmes, fats, that kind of stuff, right? But you could say what you did like. So when somebody wrote in and said they wanted a black houseboy, like, oh, that doesn't fall outside of our policy, but that may, you know, like, and the thing got published and like all hell broke loose, right? Of course, right? Once again, the collective's inability to kind of understand how the racial dynamics had changed, or what people's sensitivities were, or like why this might be important to people, right? And our inability to foresee that. So classified ads were always something very useful, something that has changed completely, and also something very, what would be the word, volatile in terms of understanding the way that that gay men and women related to each other and what desires were and how they could be articulated and that kind of thing.
Nick, do you have a favorite classified ad? Because I know personally sometimes when I just need to like have a little bit of a giggle, sometimes we do go and look to see how people were describing themselves.
Yeah.
Because I think the vocabulary changes, right? And so what was being discussed then is not necessarily what we would hear today when we were expressing ourselves necessarily.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there was a lot of coded language. There was one ad, I love it, asked for a French polish. And I was like, oh, what is a French polish? And then you think about it and like, oh, it's coded for a hand job. At the very least. And so I really I thought classifieds were always, they could be whimsical, they could be really cute. People would be very explicit sometimes. They'd be like, I'm into cowboy aesthetics, I want kink, I want harnesses. I'm like, okay, like I'm talking an abundance of detail. But other times they were like, I'm just looking for companionship, I'm just looking for a friend, I'm just looking. And so it could be an ad this big, it could be an ad that was a sizable paragraph. Tim is right. There was a policy relatively early on, once people started getting really upset by some people saying like no fats, no femmes, because there were ads like that. So it was in response to those types of ads that the Body Politic basically said, say what you do want, do not say what you don't want, right? Because no one wants to hear from a jerk, basically. But people actually found ways around that through the use, sort of the manipulation of semantics. And I always thought that was interesting. And I write about this a little, that people would say, I am a white, masculine, and masculine was used a lot, good-looking, buff, white dude, whatever, looking for the same. Same. That, right? And I said the politics of sameness come out there, where it was basically saying, if you do not match this criteria, so, if you do not look like me in the mirror, do not apply. And for me, especially as somebody who, at the time, I was I was in my PhD, and so I'm reading all these things, but I'm also like, I discover gym culture, and I discover certain life in Ottawa, and you sort of see the community dynamics, and you realize, oh, some things don't necessarily change, right? How much certain things progress, and how much certain things kind of just stay the status quo. And again, that was partly why I became so fascinated with the classified ads. But you're right, they could be such important ways of connecting people. They could also be Tinder for some very explosive moments. To the credit of the Body Politic, though, with the houseboy ad, is that they actually end up publishing every single memo internally for readers to look at in the Body Politic, to actually these are what our internal memos are saying, and just to show you that this was not an easy decision to come to, right? And they try to show their rationalization. And I thought that type of transparency also speaks volumes of the type of paper the Body Politic was, that it wasn't just some newspaper, that it was actually trying to be consciousness raising type of content, right?
Yeah, trying to show accountability or decision making, even if it wasn't necessarily a decision that a lot of people wanted. Yeah. It's basically time for questions. So let's see, what can we talk about? Well, I'll read the questions and figure out what the next question is. But Nick, do you want to talk about, thank you, what you think, so we're talking about the danger of these and the entrapment that happened. What do you think the raid on the Body Politic offices kind of, what impact it had on the community? Because of course it was membership lists and other, archival material. There was equivalent of 12 banker boxes of material that was taken out of the Body Politic offices during the raid. That material wouldn't be returned until the early 90s, so well after the Body Politic had closed. So what do you think the impact of police raids had on the actual Body Politic itself and the way that community saw it or felt secure to kind of be continuing to participate with it?
Yeah, it's always difficult to kind of get into the mindset of what that was like for those who are on the collective. And I think perhaps Tim could speak more authoritatively on that. But I imagine it shook the community. If you had a publication that was as widely, I think, appreciated and read and contributed to as the Body Politic, and even through classified ads, so people who are kind of going out on a limb and giving some of their personal information, and that is now being confiscated by the police, you're going to be very scared. Again, this is also at a time when there are no protections. And so when you have things like, I'm even thinking of like the John Damien case, right, where he's fired from the Ontario Racing Commission for being identified as a homosexual, even though he was openly gay. It's that someone upper in the administration heard and didn't like that, and so they kind of found an excuse to oust him. I think a lot of people were scared, especially if they were in government positions. They were teachers, or they were professors, or, some sort of civil servant at the municipal, provincial, or federal level. And but I'd be interested to hear from Tim about like what that raid did for like sort of the mindset of the collective.
A lot of people lost a lot of sleep, right? Because, we didn't know whether we were all going to be dragged off to jail or not, right? Or what was going to happen next. So it was very, very stressful, of course. In terms of community, it was both something that galvanized people and something that divided people. So the raid was subsequent to an article that Gerald Hennon wrote called Men Loving Boys Loving Men, which was about child-adult sexuality. And so a lot of people said, like, why the hell would you publish an article like that anyway? That's like madness, right? You're courting disaster. And like a lot of the kind of the lesbian community were like furious at the Body Politic for like producing this kind of crisis and bringing the cops down on the community, and then asking for community support, right? A lot of dykes had children, and they felt that child-adult relationships were kind of necessarily exploitative and dangerous and all of that kind of stuff. So it produced this kind of division. But on the other hand, it was seen as an attack on the press that needed to discuss kind of really complex issues. And so I don't know if you've seen the files from the Body Politic Free the Press Fund, but like people all across North America and Europe too sent in like tiny donations of like $5, $6, and these letters of support from collectives and things that we didn't know existed. And so on the one hand, it became this international issue that the press needed to be protected, and then it also produced the divisions over the question of like, what is consent, and how do age differences affect the ability to give consent, and all of this kind of stuff. Gerald, I think, in that original article was part of that kind of early gay liberation culture that we talked about before, about any sex is good sex and let's have more of it, right? And he didn't really ever have much of a analysis of power relationships and how that might be affecting stuff. He just didn't. Gerald, in one of his obituaries, I wrote something about the fact that for a person who caused such political uproar, Gerald Hennon did not have a political bone in his body, right? He wrote what he felt was true, and he never thought about the bloody consequences, which could be infuriating, but on the other hand was kind of refreshing, I guess. So yeah, it was a major. I mean, it kept the paper going, right? Because suddenly to close down the paper in that kind of a situation would have been this tremendous defeat, and therefore we had to keep on going. And in fact, it wasn't until those cases were over and sexual orientation was added to the Human Rights Code in '86 that suddenly, I guess, the exhaustion took over and the thing collapsed.
So that goes really well into one of our first questions from the audience is, how did the body politic benefit from and struggle with censorship, a lack of censorship in print? And it's important to note that, of course, material that was coming from the United States was being seized at the border. It wasn't getting through to shops like Glad Day or Little Sisters. So the body politic was Canadian, and that probably had a large impact on whether or not it would end up on the shelves for people to purchase.
Yeah, I mean, censorship was an issue that united people, basically. I mean, no matter what you thought about anonymous sex or pornography or whatever, well, maybe not pornography, but the idea that the government was going to control what you could read, that didn't seem like a good thing for most people. And so that was an issue that kind of really pulled people together. And so, I mean, that's why we fought that issue of that men loving boys loving men thing on the platform of freedom of the press rather than the platform of who should be having sex with who, right? Which is a very divisive issue, right? And so we were smart enough to be able to navigate those kinds of things and realize that probably the most important thing to worry about as a community was the question of government censorship, and not the kind of complex issues of the ins and outs of who was having sex with who and when and how and that kind of thing.
And censorship also it reverberated with sort of internal disagreements about what was and was not appropriate content, right? Because you had feminists writing and saying, no, like certain content isn't necessarily acceptable or should be permitted in the body politic. And you had the government. There's an MP, I want to say Meighen, but I could be wrong. His first name's slipping me, but he ran a commission on looking at censorship in Canada and targeting particularly homosexual content. And he actually brought on prominent second-wave feminists to sort of speak about the harms of pornography, again, during those sort of feminist sex wars or the early. And so it was interesting to see that, and he was very anti-feminist, how he kind of brought some of these individuals on in order to promote a different cause, so to speak, right? This attack on censorship, or to reinforce a type of censorship. But yeah, and I found that even in the content of the body politic itself, the pages, there was some instances of nudity, but I also found there was a lot of illustrative drawings. And I think that circumvented certain things because these weren't always individuals. It might be like, a drawing of some figure with like their butt cheeks kind of like, being a little cheeky, so to speak, and things. But I think because it was artistic, or you'd have like, I'm thinking of the work of Norman Hatton and his photographs, and he has like, perhaps a young man laying on a bed and you can see his butt, or a guy in a jock straps and smoking, and like these really interesting images. But they were provocative, but they weren't lewd. And I think that also, in some ways, allowed the body politic to sort of circumvent those types of restrictions, those censorship. But, I think the government always had a very vague idea of what would be and it would not be considered obscene content. And, of course, they weaponized it as they saw fit. But yeah, the body politic always had that sort of interesting relationship with the kind of content they showed, because they'd show film stills from documentaries or like pornography. They would be like, this is a great porn to watch. It's like Boys in the Sand. And it's like, but it wouldn't be a nude still from it, but it would be like, these are both two shirtless men in like bikinis, right? And so like, you got the picture, you got the idea.
Then there was the, I don't know if you remember it, but there was Audrey Beardsley, is there like a cartoonist, right? And so, it was an early issue. It was before I joined the collective. They did a full spread of one of these pictures of three individuals with enormous penises of different shapes and sizes. But one was the Conservative leader, Robert Stanfield. The other was the Liberal leader, and the other was the NDP leader at the time. And so it was all this kind of like, who had the biggest dick, right? And it was like really well done, because it was seamless the way they managed to put the heads on the drawings and everything. And that one, the police marched into the office, and I think the collective actually did remove all of the copies from the, it was the Herald Head, it was something else.
The Herald Head, yes.
Yeah.
When
There was just
the
a warning with that
heterosexuals
one.
died.
Don't you ever
Yeah.
do that again. And so, well, we didn't do that again, but we did other things again.
There's plenty other things that you could do in the future. Yeah. So arts, we're going to stick on arts. So can you talk about how the Body Politic engaged with arts, maybe the theater, since we are here? So reviews, opinion pieces, those all existed. So anybody want to take that question a little bit?
I mean, yeah, it's the exact date slipping me, but I would say by the late 70s, maybe going slightly into the early 80s, they had an entire section of the paper called Out in the City. And it was great. It would talk about the theater. It would show movies that were going on, gallery exhibits that you could attend, right? So the work of photographers or painters. And I thought that was a really appreciated point, because it allowed people who might not be in the know or might be new to Toronto or just visiting an idea of where to go, what was going on in the city, what was, a spot that they could go to. And of course, there was a lot of work done with ballet and dance. And I'm actually on another project looking at the history of AIDS in dance. And the Body Politic offered a lot of opportunity for sort of those cultural critiques to take place. And most of the time they were quite laudatory. They were quite celebratory of that any kind of queer showing was being done in the city. But it was primarily Toronto focused. So I will say that there was, for a paper that at this point had expanded scope to really deal with a lot of Canadian news, not to mention some international happenings, as Tim noted. The Out in the City and sort of those artistic commentaries were very much focused on what was happening in Toronto. But it was interesting because there were plays and exhibits that were going on. Like there was a play in 1984, I want to say, as early as 84, that was a play about the response to AIDS. Like I was like, that was extremely early. And there was already a play going on about that. And the Body Politic was reporting on this. And so, many of these plays and these types of artistic venues don't have the type of ephemera left. Like they don't have that material that's been recorded. And so it's been documented in the Body Politic, thankfully, again, reiterating the importance of the paper as an archival database.
That also produced one of the big early fights in the collective, because by the late 70s, early 80s, about a third of the papers were sold in Toronto, another third were sold across Canada, and another third were internationally distributed. And so what did it mean for people living in Wawa to hear about some really cool experimental play that was taking place in a tiny gallery with 15 people on Queen Street in Toronto, right? And so people kept saying, why don't you do cultural stuff that we can see? Like, what happens to television? What happens to movies? What happens to books that you can buy, right? And so there was this fight in the collective because the people who were doing the arts and culture section were very hooked into that kind of alternative arts scene in downtown Toronto. Alex Wilson was kind of the head of the Out in the City. And so after every issue, there would be a special collective meeting where it would be like a potluck, and we would dissect the issue and say what went wrong, what went right, what's a good article, what was bad, what we can do differently, right? There was this postpartum, we called them, right? And finally, Alex had to leave the collective, right? Because he would not change the focus of this, and move it to something that was more popular, that would deal with other audiences. And and in retrospect, that was a very sad thing, but it showed you the kind of tensions that happened to a community paper that was becoming, or trying to become, all things to all people, right? Because it couldn't, you couldn't focus on Toronto if you were going to be international and national. But if you dealt with stuff that only people nationally and internationally could access, then the Toronto art scene would disappear, right? So it's like, how do you balance those kinds of things?
We're going to stay on, slightly. So the question is, with all respect to the activism, politics, and advocacy, were there stories printed to celebrate joy and love that you could share? So how did joy and love manifest itself outside of the classified ads? Maybe.
What do you think, joy and love? It was like a celebration of sexuality, I think, that was through the paper. We mostly tried to deal with issues, and I guess joy and love are not so much, issues, right? But okay, I think of one that, once again, always got us in trouble. Gerald wrote an article on the mine shaft. He visited the mine shaft in New York. And the mine shaft was like the dirtiest of the dirty sex places, right? I mean, I'm putting dirty in, right? Because who knows how you describe it politically correctly? I have no idea. So you could go in and sit in the bathtub and people would pee on you and stuff like this, right? And so Gerald was saying, this is our sexuality, but we need to be able to express it better than it's being expressed. And so, I tied your heart to mine through the golden arc of my piss, right? Making it really romantic, right? And then other people said, it's not romantic, and that's the whole point, right? And so there was kind of a debate about sexuality and what was love, and, do you love the one you're with, or you're with the one you love, that kind of thing, right? That began to deal with those issues. There was another article on cruising, I remember, kind of very playful article on cruising, the ins and outs. That actually dealt with kind of racial prejudice in cruising and all of those kinds of things. And of course, that got people pissed off too, because that was done at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And how could we promote cruising when it was killing people and all of this kind of stuff? So that even when you tried to deal with joy and love, right, you still got into trouble, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even I'm thinking of joyful moments, they had at one point, it was early on, I want to say it was 1973 or so, there was the Mr. Macho contest. And one of the judges was the owner of a chain of bathhouses. Slipping my mind right now. Yes, Club Baths. And anyways, it was just a whole article just celebrating these men going on stage and doing these very campy performances. And, some people were a little critical, I think, of it. It's it's white, pretty people being celebrated again. But there were moments of just celebrating sort of a campy community function, right? Or you had moments of even seeing those glimmers on reports of Halloween. So Halloween was right? They call it gay Christmas. And, yes, there were reports of people getting eggs thrown at them or rocks thrown at them or beer bottles. But then there was also moments of showing how this was a huge moment for the community to get together, because it was kind of the one night a year when you could sort of transgress gender roles and no one could say anything about it. Right? I just think of Mean Girls in the back of my head. But, so there were those instances, but, I think of what Tim's saying, and there was always by and large, a political slant to it. There was always a point to that. There wasn't the type of just yeah, we're gay and we're happy and we're love. There was an understanding of that, but there was also, it was a much different climate. And I even think about this when I'm writing my own stuff is I am standing on the shoulders of giants. I get to enjoy rights and privileges and freedoms here and now because of the work of people, as Gary Kinsman calls them, our forefuckers. But because of the work that, people have done decades before me, right? That have, through their compassion and rage and love and perseverance, been able to afford me certain rights and privileges and protections, right? So I get the opportunity about talking about queer joy or love, but that wasn't always on the radar of people when you're worried about if you're going to keep your job, or if you get to keep shelter over your head, or if you won't get beat up walking alone at night, right? So,
yeah. So we're talking about the Body Politic as the first significant gay paper. So some of the other papers and newsletters that came before. Les Mouches Fantastiques is the earliest known, and that's out of Montreal, and that's 1918. Very few issues of it still exist. But do you think the Body Politic was influenced by any particular newspaper, or do you think it was just kind of organically came out of like what was being created, and it was just building blocks up to the Body Politic?
Well, we didn't know about Les Mouches Fantastiques in those days. The Body Politic, the first issue came as a result of people being dissatisfied with the report on the Ottawa We Demand demonstration in 1971 in Guerrilla newspaper. And I had worked in Guerrilla newspaper, which was a countercultural newspaper. So the early Body Politic came out of the countercultural movement more than any kind of queer foremothers or forefathers. But when we came out, The Advocate was already publishing, I think, the Washington Blade, the Gay Community News out of Boston. Those were about the only ones, and so I don't think you could draw out. There was one newspaper, which was the Mattachine Society newspaper that came out of L.A. basically. But no, I don't think you can find a genealogy of newspapers that led up to the Body Politic in that way. It was it came elsewhere. It was something that emerged at a particular moment in history, that the counterculture was beginning to fragment among particular lines and particular politics.
Yeah. So Nick, the next question is going to be for you, which is, what do you think the new version of the Body Politic? Is there a version of the Body Politic that kind of exists today? Is it on social media? Is it online newspapers? Do you think that, do we have something that is, I know we don't have the equivalent, but like, where do you think it's kind of ended up today? Where do you think this new next generation is kind of getting this type of news? And what does it mean that we don't really have it all in one spot? It's, this is, you're going on social media and you're getting bits and pieces from people in all different places.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in many ways it has become decentralized. And I think there's a lot of pros to that, right? I mean, you're not having a small group controlling sort of the narrative or prioritizing certain news over others, right? I mean, different groups are discussing local community affairs in different ways, right? And you still have individual, groups were operating at a municipal level, right? Like local prides and things like that. And they're sharing those types of news in those organizations. But I think a lot of the type of consciousness raising that's being done today is through social media. It's through things like TikTok or Instagram or, that type of community building. As somebody who teaches at a smaller university in the British Columbia interior, I see firsthand about, how students are engaging with queer history and queer activism in a fundamentally different way than students would be in Toronto. Like, we're not worried about Toronto's queer history because we know it. And we're learning, yes, new histories, but it's there and it's well preserved. What we don't know is what those kind of queer histories are in smaller communities, like in BC, when a lot of students are like, this is my first introduction to queer history, and they're taking it, even a queer culture, like they were like, oh, I knew nothing really about AIDS until I took your queer activism class, and this is first year university now, right? Like it's not being done in high school, it's not being done in grade school. So I think I feel a sense of responsibility with that type of work at the university level, right, in terms of education. But I think a lot of people are using social media to connect with one another, to build different types of communities. I also think that the queer community has become increasingly vibrant and sort of has sort of different groups within it, right? And it's not as much of a homogenous one size fits all. And I think that's a great thing. But I also sometimes like when we can all get back together and just say like, yeah, there's a reason why we all kind of celebrate Pride, for instance.
Except we don't even. I think that you're right about the media. The media world being fragmented, but also this notion of community, which may always have been largely imaginary, right? But we did imagine kind of a community there. And that imagination, we've lost that imagination, right? There's like a meme going around, like not gay as in happy, but queer as in free Palestine, right? So there's like juxtaposition of kind of a political notion of queer with the kind of the normative, like let's all be buff and dance and take drugs and have lots of sex, people that are gay men. Like both of those are pretty stereotypical, right? But this is how the community itself is beginning to see itself. So in Toronto now we've got Pride and we've got alternative Pride, right? And the alternative Pride is much smaller, but still imagines itself as being like at the forefront of politics, whereas it imagines Pride being at the far back end of politics, right? And so I think that's, in terms of a media that would like be community media, I think it's hard to imagine that, because I think it's hard to imagine community now, because, once again, I can go back to my rant about neoliberalism, but it has changed the class structure of Canada, right? We are no longer all in the same boat. Large numbers of people live incredibly precarious existences. Some always have, like Indigenous people always have, right? So what that means is that we don't go to the same places anymore, right? We don't do the same kinds of things. We don't read the same kinds of things or engage in the same kind of media. We live in very different worlds. You could see that blow up around Black Lives Matter and Toronto Pride, where they said, like, why do we have these phalanxes? And then really, they were phalanxes of armed policemen marching in the parade, right? These are scary people, right? If you're a young black person, right? These are the people that beat you up and still arrest you and card you and harass. Like, why are they in our community parade, right? Whereas other people, this is a sign of progress, because before they used to beat us up and card us and that kind of stuff. Well, maybe they don't beat you up anymore, but not other people. So it's those kinds of divisions in community, I think, which are reflected in the divisions in the media, because we're not talking across those kinds of lines anymore. Now, maybe if Poilievre takes over and Trump takes over, we're going to have to start hanging out together again, right? But at this point, we are in a very fractious state of community. We've always been fractious, but I've never seen anything like the kinds of different worlds that people live in today.
Well, and just to go off that, I will say that I've seen a rise in sort of the apathetic gay. And it's the idea of like, well, I've done well under this system. I have a great job. I do well. I have a nice place. Why do I care? Like, the system works for me now. So if I'm into the system and it works for me, why should I worry about anybody else? And I think it's because there's this generation that, their connection to the gay community or queer community is often through a digital app. It's just, so like the lack of physical spaces. We're seeing the death of the gay bar across cities, right? And so there's no communal watering hole, so to speak, where you can meet people from all different walks of life. And so then people become sort of insular. They enter their own little, and people like a vacuum chamber. They want to be able to talk to groups that echo their same lines of thought, right? And I see this on TikTok, and I need to not doom scroll, but you see this on TikTok, and it's a lot of people, like I see, and there's not just white cis gay men, it's a lot of just cis gay men, but of all backgrounds saying like, this is why I don't go to Pride anymore, because it's too queer. I'm like, well, what is too queer? And it's because it's become almost too political, and they just want to have a good time because they want to go on their Atlantis cruise and, do their thing. And, and that's fine if you like to enjoy it, but like, disregarding the politics or the needs of others isn't, you know what I mean? And it's not what the spirit of Pride was all about. And so, yeah, I think that, we've created these new different types of clusters.
Yeah, the fragmentation of where politics exists within your identity. And for some, the politics are right up front and they make a conscious choice for it to be, or they don't have the choice. It just exists there. And the people that choose to see politics as something that they don't need to engage in. But, we're very much facing a time when politics will be very much back in our faces in a way that I don't think younger generations are prepared for. And we see that already in places like Saskatchewan and New Brunswick and even in Quebec. So that brings us to the end. I only went over by 2 minutes. I tried really hard. Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. There was a lot of questions. I'm sorry we could not get to all of them, but thank you very much for listening to us today. Thank you very much for your participation, Tim, Nick, and thank you for Stratford for having a place for us to engage in these type of conversations every year. I think this is year 3? Maybe 3 of us bringing queer and trans history into the space. And we're very pleased that we can come and offer a chance to impart some history on you folks. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for listening. This event was recorded as part of the Meighen Forum in front of a live audience in Lazaridis Hall at the Tom Patterson Theatre in Stratford, Ontario, Canada. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with the lively conversations and original performances housed by the Stratford Festival's streaming service, Stratfest at Home. And for making it this far in the episode, we're going to give you a gift. Enjoy 1 month free on Stratfest at Home with promo code FREEMONTH. Visit stratfestathome.ca and enter code FREEMONTH to enjoy 1 month of free streaming content. It takes you, our listeners, to make this possible. It also takes the support of our dear collaborator. Support for the Meighen Forum is generously provided by Kelly and Michael Meighen and the T.R. Meighen Family Foundation. Original score for the Everyday Forum podcast was provided by Hilary Adams. Production support is provided by the film production and distribution team at the Stratford Festival. That is manager Yash Chabria, film editor Chris von Kleist, and director Jenna Dixon. The Meighen Forum team is producing assistants Renata Hansen and James Hyatt, coordinator Mira Henderson, manager Gregory McLaughlin, and director Julie Miles. Special thanks to Michael Adams, Jennifer Lee, Greg Doherty, Harper Charlton, and Kendallin Bishop. Finally, thanks to artistic director Anthony Cimolino and executive director Anita Gaffney. From here in Stratford, Ontario, on the land of the Neutrals and the Anishinaabe, see you next time. Ba Ma Pi.